time to start the session. Troubleshooting your designers and vector graphic. Please give a warm welcome to Michelle.
All right. Oh, excellent. So today I'm going to be kind of running through a bit of an experience that I had last year, which was actually for the first time adding vector graphics to our application. This was made a little bit more difficult by the fact that I actually work for Moneytree here in Tokyo, but I live in Sydney, Australia. So whenever I had to talk to the designers, it's not just a matter of walking over to their desk. They're across an entire ocean, and actually in winter here, where Australia, Sydney is actually 2 hours ahead of Tokyo. And because people here start a bit later, it also means the amount of time we have culturally as well as time zone is actually a little bit narrower. So being able to effectively communicate with the designers was helpful in trying to work out some of the suboptimal exports that we were getting out of the tools. So why did we vectorize our assets? And there's a few reasons. You get a smaller APK when you're using the vector graphics. This is becoming less of a problem with App Bundle, where you only have to ship the assets specific to the screen density. But for us, the bigger concern was reducing the duplication. So when you're using PNGs, you have to provide all the different contrasts for your application. So if you have a light background, you need to provide the darker contrast, and if you have a white background, you have to provide the I think I just repeated myself there. But you have to provide contradicting contrast so people can see the icons relative to the context in which you're looking at them in. So the first thing that we need to start doing is exporting our icons. So if we start with just a nice simple icon here that we want to export, so it's just a nice 24 by 24 icon for like a little menu here. I just saw this in the material design, so we don't actually have this icon here. But when we actually export it, we see that the actual size is 16 by 16, and the view box, so the view box, if you're not familiar with the SVG specification or the vector drawables, that's the virtual canvas that you're drawing in, and when you inflate the vector drawable, it will then take those numbers and scale them to meet the actual size that you want it to be drawn at. But here, we can see that we have this translation. So where is this coming from? Okay, so let's go back into our sketch, and we can see our icon is 24 by 24, and what we're missing is this kind of intrinsic padding around the icon. So the icon is inside what's in Sketch is called an artboard, and you find something similar in other tools like Illustrator. So when we've gone to export the icon, we've selected the icon and exported it. And when you're exporting it from Sketch, the drawing instructions in Sketch are relative to the artboard. So it's translating the icon to fit into the size in which we're actually trying to export the icon from. So we actually need to export the artboard. And in Sketch, this is fairly easy because often you'll find that your designers will use a single icon in a single artboard. This is because they can recycle the artboards, because you can use artboards as in Sketch called symbols. And a symbol is basically the ability to reference artboards to one another. This allows you to create composite artboards out of smaller ones. In Illustrator, this is a bit harder because people tend to have much larger artboards. So I didn't have this problem, but if the designer won't export the artboard for whatever reason, they're like, no, the icon's fine, I exported it fine. You're like, no, I need you to export with the white space padding. This icon here doesn't really have that problem, where it's a fairly symmetrical shape, but if you're exporting something which is asymmetrical and off-centered, then having that intrinsic white space padding around that centered icon becomes more important. In this case, it's fairly trivial to remove it. We can just increase the size back to what it was and just delete the translation. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but especially in things like Illustrator, you'll tend to have more kind of monolithic artboards, or if your sketch files are quite old, where you don't have the ability to reference artboards from each other and using the symbols, you may have all your icons in one giant artboard. In Sketch, this is pretty easy to solve. You just need to ask your designers to use a slice, and a slice will give you, well, a slice of that artboard, and it will paint everything in the artboard relative to the viewport that the slice is then exposing. So in this case, I can just slice over 4 other icons in my monolithic artboard and export them all. Now they'll all be exported relative to that slice, so maybe not the most practical example, but it gives you an idea that you can start to kind of export stuff in a way that's specific to the requirements of the Android team. Importing, this used to be more of an issue. Android Studio is now, for the most part, solved. Though if you do run into problems, the SVG to Android, I found tends to get around most of them. And I say mostly solved because there are still issues popping up. There's one from Alex Lockwood from December last year where it wasn't translating one of the instructions properly and the whole SVG just kind of exploded. All right. Let's dig into what's wrong in the matrix, or in this case, what's wrong with our vectors. So one of the most common things that I ran across was that because we'd been using PNGs for so long, a lot of our designers were kind of used to the assumption that when we export something, we don't have to care so much about how the shape was made. When you're exporting in vector graphics, this becomes a little bit more important. So things like how complex the shape is, can affect the path length. So let's take my favorite example that I actually took, like, it's a bit hard to see. It's a bit of a plane. So this plane that might be a bit hard to see, again, for someone who is talking about vector graphics, I should be able to do better contrast here. So I don't expect you to be able to read that at all, but this is kind of my point here. By the end of it, we'll be able to read what's happening over there. So to start with, let's just run it through a tool called SVGO. So the vector we saw before had very high precision with its floating point numbers. Now, we don't need that level of precision because when you rasterize to a bitmap, the precision kind of becomes irrelevant when everything in the bitmap is either in a pixel or not. So let's just run this through the optimizer and have it strip everything down to 2-point precision. Whether you pick 2 or 3-point precision, it's kind of up to you, I would say. For icons where they're just like 24 or 48, 2-point precision, I would say, is fine. If you need to do stuff larger, where you might see some of that artifacting around the edges, then maybe 3-point precision. So now you can read what's going on here. Well, if you could read that natively, I'd be impressed. But we're down to probably it's like 73% smaller. But, we can do better. So if we dig into how the shape is being made here, you can see all the little blue dots around the outside of the shape, and then we're filling in the shape in the vector here. Now, because we have to trace all around the outline, we effectively have to double the size of the SVG that we need to be able to export, because we need to have all these anchor points. So the blue things are the anchor points. That's where the vector is drawing from point to point. They need to be on both sides, and sometimes they can be really close together just to give us this nice asymmetrical curve on the shape here. But what we did for this one was actually really easy. We just told Illustrator to convert it to a stroked path instead. So there was nothing that the designer had to do here. There's a few artifacts, if you can see them, like the tail doesn't quite connect to the body as smoothly as it could. But with a little bit of tweaking, we were able to get the icon down to the point of where you can actually see all the paths. And if you're used to reading the vector instructions, you could probably look at that and get a fair idea about what's happening. There's a few other optimizations you can have your designers do, and I recommend asking them. Is things like flattening the layers. This will reduce the complexity of your shapes quite a bit. Merging paths. This becomes kind of important because the vector paths, you can actually have them, you don't have to have separate paths. You can just have the vector instruction just jump from position to position, rather than everything being relative to each other. And you can start to kind of merge the shapes. So what other kind of pitfalls are there? So we didn't actually encounter this one ourselves, but this is something I found out about fairly recently, and that is to avoid clip path. So this usually comes about when you're using masks, and clip paths on Android just aren't anti-aliased. So even though this picture is a bit blurry, the one on the far right here is even more kind of pixely around the edges. Often it is more expensive in the vector drawable to apply the mask than it is to just draw the individual shapes. And if you want to see more of this, you can go watch the Alex's Lockwood from Ordev in Sweden from last year. Now this is something that really, really tripped me up. Avoid using tint in your layouts. This is this might not be as important if you only have one icon. If you only have one icon, go ahead and tint it. But for us, we have lots of screens where we have long lists of financial transactions, and in there we have lots of repeated icons that all have the same color. So why is tinting bad in this case where we tend to repeat ourselves quite a bit? And the reason it's bad is because when you apply the tint, the vector, when it's inflated, will no longer have the same tint as when it's inflated, because the tint in the XML is a setter which is applied after the inflation of the actual drawable. So in this case, we're always going to return false and that we can reuse. And every time we draw an individual row in our list, every single time we will create another bitmap. Now, I was talking to some of the Googlers yesterday, and they said that the inflation should be cached even in this case, but we're still creating duplicate bitmaps to apply that tinting to. So the question is, how do we cache hit? And the way in which we cache hit is by using the theme. And this tends to work fairly well when you want to have the icon have a color that contrasts to your theme, because often you want to have a white icon and a dark background. So applying a custom theme a custom color in your theme is probably the simplest way to do this, because all we have to do in the vector drawable is say fill color equals the theme color. In this case, the vector drawable will be cached every single time, so we only have to draw and color that bitmap once, and then we can reuse it throughout as much as we want. If, for whatever reason, that's not practical, there's a really easy way to do it. Just cache it somewhere. So easiest way would be like if you have a single activity of multiple fragments, just have something in the activity where you can cache a drawable. If you need a more complex solution, I'd recommend looking at what Picasso does for the LRU cache, and it'd be fairly easy to adapt that to work for your vector drawables and have your own little cache for just keeping them in memory. An important thing to remember is that if you don't specify the size, it will use the size in the vector drawable. So in this case, I specified one icon as being 48 by 48. And if you just say wrap content, it's just going to fall back to whatever is in the vector drawable. This is a really trivial example, but I have seen apps where people have exported quite large SVGs into their app, and so if they forget to put wrap content, they start to draw something which is possibly several megabytes of a bitmap, and so your app will crash. Right, so something else to watch out for. Sorry for the quality of that picture. This actually came in a bug report. So it turns out there's a really good reason to always use the vector support library, and don't rely on it always doing the right thing in all the right cases. Make sure you test on all the devices as much as absolutely possible. So we want to draw this little knife and fork icon, but for some reason on some KitKat devices, not all of them for some reason, we get all these drawing artifacts where the knife or the fork don't quite get drawn properly. And so when we sat down to work out what's happening here, I found the designer was not using a mask, but was relying on the properties of the odd-even fill rules. So they were compositing these shapes together and then exporting the composite shape. And that seemed to work in most cases, except when it didn't, in which case it failed horribly. So for this, we just kind of use the outline paths. Now, I said before to avoid outline paths, but the shape is fairly simple, and it does fit under that 1,000 character limit. So if you're not going over that 1,000 character limit and getting that lint warning, don't worry too much about getting stuff super optimized, because once that inflation happens and it's cached, you don't have to pay that performance penalty anymore. And once it's bitmap, it's the same size regardless of how complex the shape is used to draw it. If you wanted to optimize this, I suppose you could use a mixture of stroked and outline paths if you really want to get the size down. But speaking of optimizations, one thing that you need to take into consideration is how you align your vectors in your designer tool. So in this case, I've intentionally offset this from the grid. So normally you want to have your icon vectors, you want to, as much as possible, have the vector start at a whole number point. So you want to start at 22 across, 10 down, or whatever. If you start at 22.26 across, everything now requires floating point precision. So in this case, our path here is like, I think it's like 700 characters long. So just by having it off that grid alignment, we get the shape pretty much doubles in size to what we can actually do. So if we actually put it on the grid and have everything as much grid aligned as possible, and for some reason here Sketch has put me 0.01 off the grid, which will sometimes happen. So make sure your designers are using the lock plugin where it locks everything in Sketch, because Sketch has a really bad habit of just moving something slightly and no one notices until you realize all your vectors are absolutely enormous. So it's important that you make sure that the vectors are always grid aligned. Now, let's look at some of the tools we can use. So Avocado is a good tool if you don't want to optimize in the SVG, or you've already got vector graphics that you want to improve in some way or another. So if you just run Avocado over the directory, it will go through every individual vector drawable and optimize it. It even removes white space, because I think if you actually decompile the APK, that white space is still in there. So even though it's nicer to look at the vector drawables, you're adding a little bit more to your APK size. Now it's a few hundred bytes, so if you want trying to get below just that 10 megabyte limit, this might be a good candidate to pull it down a little bit more. Now, this is by the company who actually makes Sketch. They actually make a Sketch plugin for running SVGO. So when your designers are exporting from Sketch, or whenever you're exporting from Sketch, you can actually run this plugin be run on your export, and there's a really good set of defaults from, again, Alex Lockwood. His name comes up, him and, what's that guy from Google? Yeah, I'm very descriptive there. Nick Butcher. Alex Lockwood and Nick Butcher always come up everywhere when you're talking about vector drawables. So it's kind of hard to avoid the two. So they've gone through and configured SVGO to be optimized for what they think is the best settings for Android. So you don't have to learn what SVGO is, what all the rules do, and all that stuff. So this is a really good tool and really good configuration, even if you aren't using the exporter. So some of the takeaways I want people to kind of go away with is to avoid the Eclipse paths from using masks. Avoid even odd fill rule. This is usually a setting in Sketch. Most of the time this isn't a problem, except when you're trying to do that kind of nested Russian doll approach and abusing the fill rule to make simpler shapes. It's often not as it might be easier for the designer, but it's going to create a lot of problems for you when you're trying to get this vector drawable to work across all your supported devices. Try to avoid outline strokes. So we want to try to use the path strokes as much as possible. Again, it's a bit harder with asymmetrical shapes, but if you've got nice kind of squared off shapes, the strokes paths tend to work really well. Even if you do want to have rounded edges, that's also something that's supported on the strokes path. So prefer theming color when possible. Make sure that you align to the grid to reduce the amount of floating point precision that you need for each of the anchor points. Flatten the layers as much as possible. You want to merge as many shapes and paths as you can, and you want to run optimization tools when you're happy with your design. I do have a warning about the optimization tools. Sometimes they can be a little aggressive. And so don't just rely on the optimization tool always getting things perfectly right. Look at how the icon renders before, and then try it with the tool and look at how it renders afterwards. If your designers are doing something fancy, the tool may misinterpret their intent with how they're abusing the vector path specification, and may actually cause something to be wrong with your application. And so that's kind of my journey through adding vector drawables. There was a lot of time spent talking with designers and trying to work out why the shapes were complex. So often we would try to bring things back to using strokes paths as much as possible, trying to merge shapes as much as we can. Often your designers will design individual components and then just kind of layer them on top of each other. A lot of tools like Illustrator are really, really good at being able to do this path merging and morphing. Sketch is a little bit harder, but fortunately tools like Avocado and SVGO will, if they can see the anchor points lining up, they will join and merge the paths for you. So Money Tree is hiring in Tokyo and Sydney, and that's it. Thank you for coming.